Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are at the moment. Welcome to week 5 of Research Methods. This week we're going to be covering surveying, not in the engineering sense, but in the research sense. I'm also going to touch a little bit on the 3 pieces of assessment for this course, in the knowledge that your first piece of assessment is next week. So I'll touch a little bit on that and also focus on the other 2 pieces of assessment. So I'll cover that last. But let's make a start this week on surveying. So I've tried to synthesize this week's information into 3 very basic, very simple ideas. Again, the idea of these mini lectures is really to consolidate learning in this subject, to really give you an understanding of, I guess, from a personal point of view, what I think is important for you to know as counsellors from the research field without overloading you and getting too bogged down in detail. So this week I'm going to touch very briefly on what surveying research is. It's pretty easy, it's pretty simple, you've probably all experienced it, whether you know it or not. How this type of research is done, I'm going to touch on really basic concepts there. And then I'm going to present a couple of research examples of survey research, and I'm going to use a couple of studies that I've conducted myself. So if you're not aware, I work predominantly in sports and performance settings. So it might not be the setting that's particularly interesting to you, but hey, it might actually be a nice change from the usual drudgery of depression and anxiety and things like that. Might be something just a little bit interesting. It's at least a nice context to consider some of these ideas. So let's press on with this week. Okay, so in terms of survey research, I think a lot of you have probably experienced it in some way, shape or form. I always think of the really basic lay example of survey research being if you ever go to like a shopping centre or a supermarket or things like that, and someone says, "Oh, do you mind answering a few questions?" And they're usually carrying a clipboard, and they want to tick a few boxes and things like that. That's usually an example of survey research. It's usually done on a very high population level. Australian Bureau of Statistics, a lot of the research that they do is survey research based. Every so often Australia will do a census, quite common in a lot of countries. These are other examples of survey type research. I guess the reason why this type of research is used and why it's favoured by a lot of researchers is that it's a systematic approach to data collection, and usually a lot of data can be collected this way very quickly and very efficiently. Hence why it's quite interesting for researchers. Typically it'll be through the use of questionnaires or interviews, and really it's about garnering individual perspectives about particular variables of interest. So all those kind of variables, independent variables, dependent variables that we've discussed previously, could in fact be measured using survey type research. Not always and not solely, but it's just one way in which researchers collect information. And to be fair, the vast majority of research that you're likely to review will some way be survey-based research. Typically, the idea behind survey-based research is to identify particular trends and correlations. Hence why it's really good for testing hypotheses, because it can identify whether or not there is a relationship between 2 or more variables. So I very quickly wanted to touch on how survey research is done, and these are the ideas that are covered in your textbook. I think this probably gives you a pretty good grasp of exactly what's going on in terms of survey research. So we've got really 2 types of survey research. We've got longitudinal and we've got cross-sectional. And really basically, as the title suggests, in longitudinal, we're looking at repeated measures over time. So giving probably the same measure over a number of data collection points. So maybe over a period of a couple of weeks or a couple of months or a couple of years, depending on your research question, what you're trying to address or assess or tap into. Whereas our cross-sectional research is really looking at a cross-section of a population. That means that we're only really looking at particular individuals at a particular time. We're not so much focusing on change over time or how effective interventions were or things like that. We're just trying to get a snapshot of what's going on. So let's go back, let's focus on longitudinal survey designs really quickly. And the textbook talks about 3 different types of longitudinal designs. We can have trend studies, and typically this is looking at the same demographic over time. So the demographic might be adolescence, as the textbook talks about, but it might also be something to do with gender, or it might have something to do with culture, something like that. So we're trying to say, what's going on in this particular demographic over this period of time, over a period of time. So we might look at kind of experiences of stress in children raised in post-war Australia, versus children raised in the current generation. We might try to see if there's a change in stress levels across those generations. Then we might also have cohort studies, and cohort studies are, for example, using the same subgroup over time. The textbook gives a really good example here of a clinical scenario where you might want to see if particular, let's say CBT is effective with adolescents. We want to investigate whether it is or it isn't. So we get a whole bunch of adolescents kind of pre-intervention and give them measures of psychological well-being probably, and then we give a whole bunch of adolescents same kind of survey at the end of an intervention, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be the same individuals, same participants over time. You could actually run this at the exact same time. People just before they go into a protocol or an intervention, and at the same time when other people are just leaving that same protocol, and to see if it was actually effective, that intervention. Then you have panel studies, and as the textbook identifies, this is probably the most rigorous form of longitudinal survey design. And what we're really doing here is looking at the exact same people over a period of time. So to use that same example of adolescence and the effectiveness of CBT, we'd follow those same individuals from pre to post intervention. So those are our longitudinal survey designs, and I've already touched on cross-sectional survey designs being that snapshot, one particular photo, I guess, of research, what's going on just now at this very point for a particular individual or group of individuals, and that's our difference. And as you may imagine, there's differences and arguments for the benefit of longitudinal and cross-sectional designs over one another, but at least some insight into that. So I wanted to give you 2 examples of survey research, and this is some research that I've actually done myself, so I probably speak to it quite well. My research is largely involved looking at how coaches in sport influence the development of adolescent athletes. So this was one particular study that we conducted, which is an example of cross-sectional research design. So we had 220 adolescent middle distance runners, so cross-country runners, if you're familiar with that term. Fairly even split of male and female, and we weren't really looking at gender here, but we were interested in adolescents. And then these participants, these 220 adolescents, completed 6 established measures on kind of random topics. So topics about coaching environment, so what they thought of their coaches, what it was like to go to sports training and things like that. Psychological needs satisfaction and thwarting, so how well they thought their psychological needs for autonomy, competence and relatedness were being satisfied or being thwarted. Mental toughness, to a degree, resilience, if you want to use, I guess, a bit more of a familiar term from general psychology, and also psychological health, and in that was psychological well-being and psychological ill-being, two separate ideas. And so this is a really good example of cross-sectional research, because this was just a snapshot of what was going on in this group. If you're interested, the results basically showed that better coaching environments, not surprisingly, supported psychological need satisfaction, promoted mental toughness, and had better outcomes in terms of psychological health. And the opposite was true for coaching environments, I guess negative coaching environments. So yeah, this is a good idea of what cross-sectional research looks like. and just a snapshot. And obviously you can get the information of a lot of people. 220 is a fairly reasonable number in a very short, sharp period of time. Okay, in a very similar vein, I also conducted what we would consider to be a longitudinal research design, and I'll let you decide which one of the three designs from the longitudinal side it was in your own time. But to give you some information about the research, we had 110 adolescent rowers this time, and we separated them into two groups, an intervention group and a delayed intervention group. So those ideas that split into groups might actually remind you about some of the information that we covered last week. So I had these adolescent rowers complete a battery of questionnaires at several time points. So the intervention group completed these questionnaires at baseline, at the end of the intervention, and then post-intervention. So that was kind of about a month after the intervention had finished. Whereas the delayed intervention group completed the questionnaires at baseline, and then a second baseline some time later. In other words, nothing changed between the two baselines in terms of offering an intervention. And then there was a data collection point at the end of the intervention. And this is why we called it the delayed intervention group. They didn't receive the intervention at the same time as the intervention group. They actually had a bit of a delay, so we could collect two baseline time points. We could compare within and between results. That's not really that important, but just in case you were wondering why we did it that particular way. But in this situation, what you can see is that we had the same individuals measured across time, and the purpose of it, to really hit home why we do this kind of research design, was to test the effectiveness of this intervention. And that's exactly what you're doing as a practicing professional, as a counselor, as a psychologist, or whatever it may be. When you're delivering interventions, if you're being a good practitioner, what you're doing is you're collecting baseline information before you deliver your intervention. And then you're also collecting information during as well as after your intervention to see if what you're doing is, one, being effective, and two, was effective over time. So again, that hopefully you can see a link there between why research is important and how you can actually use this information as a professional outside of the realms of research. Incidentally, this kind of research, not necessarily the one that I'm presenting, but longitudinal research, might get you thinking a little bit about your third assignment, your research report, because in a way we are doing some kind of longitudinal research there with an intervention. We're trying to see the effectiveness of this three good things intervention, and we're measuring changes in outcome variable, I guess for want of a better word, related to psychological health or psychological ill-being, if you want. So again, some really useful concepts, hopefully not only for your studies and for your assignment, but also for you as a practicing professional. And hopefully you can start to see the application of research methods, not only for research, but actually for counselling settings as well. Okay, as I said at the start, I also wanted to cover a little bit about assessment this week. Your first assignment, your online quiz, is already been uploaded. It's not available yet, but you should be able to see it on the Moodle site. It will become active at 9 o'clock on Monday next week, and it comprises 10 questions, several of which are multi-choice, some are short answer, some are definition. Well, I guess is also short answer in a way. To give you some insight into it, you can, I believe, this is the first time I've run it this way, so we might have some teething problems. Let's see how it goes. I'll make concessions where I can. But you will have one attempt, which means you can save, I believe you can save your attempt and come back. What one attempt means is as soon as you click your submit button for the quiz, that's it. You don't get to go back in and change your answers. But you can save and come back to it. Maybe what you want to do is try to answer the first question, save it, exit it, and then see if you can come back to it. You have one day in which to submit the quiz from when you open it. But you also have all week in which to access the quiz. So if you know that you're busy Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, that's fine. Don't open the quiz or don't access the quiz. When you know you've got a good period of time in which to sit down to do the quiz, then attack it, then open it. Like I said, you have 10 questions, so 24 hours should be more than enough time. Obviously, it's open book. You can use the information that you have access to answer the questions as well. It'll all be based on information covered from week 1 until week 6. So next week is also accessible in that online quiz. Any other questions about the quiz, please, by all means, put some stuff up on the forum and let's help each other out, and I'll try to chime in where I can as well. Assessment 2 is your literature review. I've had a few people contacting me about that, so that's good to see that people are moving on it. 1,500 words is your limit, and your objective, I guess, is really to use research and use the literature to identify and explain when CBT or ACT rather could be ineffective, and how we might be able to improve those particular, I guess, mainstream psychotherapies and psychological approaches. Your third assignment is a research report, and that's what we're doing with our 3 good things. We did the DAS first off, and now we're doing our 3 good things, which is our intervention. You can start looking up the intervention. Martin Seligman is the author of this particular intervention. I believe he rolled it out in Geelong Grammar in Victoria, despite him being an American. He's quite an interesting character. If you ever done any research or read anything about learned optimism and learned helplessness or hopelessness, Martin Seligman is the guy behind it. Really interesting ideas. So worthwhile looking into some of his research, getting an idea for what this intervention is, how it's supposed to work, what it's supposed to do, because you're going to write a research report on it, touching on some of the ideas that we've focused on a lot. So you'll put together an introduction with a literature review, a methods section that covers participants, measures, and procedures. I'll help you with the results part because you don't need to know about stats, and then there'll be a discussion and a reference list. But I'll touch much more on that as we go along this semester. So that's all I have to say for this week about surveying. Hopefully you got a bit more of an insight into it, as well as having an idea of how it connects with your third piece of assessment, the one that we've just touched on there, because it is a reflection of that to a degree, as well as some of the topics that we've touched on previously. So hopefully you can see a bit of a thread going through some of the lecture topics that we've covered and how they relate to that third and final piece of assessment. Next week we'll be touching on time series design, but also be aware that your online quiz is next week, your first piece of assessment. Like I said, if you have any questions, comments or ideas, please post some stuff on the forum. Really like to use the forum as much as possible. Hope you have a great week, and I will be in touch this week, or at worst, or perhaps best, depending how you look at it, next week. So take care all, and speak to you soon.